Next, axes and ticks. Or I should say, axis, not axes, right? It gets very confusing with this type of word choice, right? We always talk about axes as if they're, a plot, when in fact, axes just refers to something that we're drawing that has an x and a y axis. And if we ever want to do something with those specific axes, there is an easy way that we can simply just say, hey, I want those labels on the x-axis to be different. I want those little stems that you can just barely hardly see, I want those to be larger. And those are the features of our axis. So when I'm talking about an axis, I'm talking about what I've highlighted here, the x-axis in my circle. Or we can go with the y-axis here, also in my ellipse. And so when we think about the axis, right, I'm not talking about the high-level axes, both of them coupled together, where that's our kind of main entry point for Matplotlib. We're able to use each axis independently and create very different styled plots. And so all I'm doing here is I've just moved my plot up a little bit because I'm going to be changing the ticks. And so you see here, I've changed the ticks on my x-axis. There are two types of ticks, and there are one set of labels. The two types of ticks here, the black and larger ticks, are what we call major ticks, and the major ticks will have a corresponding label by default. The minor ticks, the ones that you see here in green, are simply there to just help you visually gauge how much distance or how many units occur between our major ticks. And you can see here that I jumped from January to April on my major ticks. And you can assume that, well, this first green one, January, February, March, right? And just by using these green ticks, you can help orient yourself a little bit better than if I just had them removed. And I don't need to actually add a label for every single date that you see. I can even turn my x-axis, just make it invisible. And I can play around with the x label itself. You've seen me, I've done this. You can use ax.setXLabel to also do this, but I wanted to show you the entry point to using the actual x-axis object itself. You can see here that we're able to set the label, and we're able to move the ticks to the top and also invert the label so that they're above the ticks instead of below. And we can control the position of the label and the ticks independently, right? There's so much customization that you can do here. And my x-axis label looks like it should be a title right now. Underneath it all, those are just text objects. That's all Matplotlib cares about. There's nothing special about your title. There's nothing special about your Y label, your X label. It's just text. We can also change the ticks on our X and Y axis. And if you've ever wanted to change how your linear space looks instead of being 0, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, etc., and I want it to be 0, 0.25, 0.5, all the way up to 1, well, I can do that with NumPy, right? I can take an A range, I can get the current limits of my x-axis, I can take a step, right, of 0.25, but you always have to be careful taking floating point steps with NumPy because sometimes the rounding errors cause you to go over or actually meet and include your endpoint, which is not what you expect from A range. But since I know that doesn't happen in this case, I also have to get my maximum X limit, right, the right-hand side, because A range is non-inclusive. And then I unpack my A range into a list so I can concatenate it together with that maximum value. And wow, we finally managed to get those ticks that I wanted from 0, 0.25, 0.5. That's a lot of work. Instead, what we can use are Matplotlib's ticker locators. And so in this locator, I've done all of the same work that I did above, except I didn't have to think about using NumPy or A range or unpacking into a list or getting the X limits and doing something separately with them. I can simply just say, hey, Matplotlib, start at the lowest part of my X limit, and then I want you to just put a mark every 0.25 units. Contrarily, we can also say, I don't care about the step of my x-axis here. I just want you to put 4 major ticks. That's it, just 4. And that's what we can do with the linear locator of 4. Additionally, we can use minor locators. And so I can have my minor ticks, those really small stems that you can see, occur every 0.05. And you can see that it doesn't really line up well with my linear locator here. And so when you're setting your major and minor ticks, it's good practice to use probably the same type of locator. In that way, you end up with a nice evenly spaced ticks. You can also use what's called an auto minor locator. This is pretty much the same thing as a linear locator, right, that we saw above, except instead of going from 0, from your minimum x value to your maximum x value, we're simply just putting 3 ticks in between each major tick. And you always include the first tick with that, and that's why you only see 2 minor ticks here. Additionally, you can also remove you can play around with the formatting of your labels. And so you can actually provide not just a locator, but a set major formatter, and this will format, right, the labels of your tick labels of your x-axis in this case. And so I can use a null formatter to actually just remove the labels. This is pretty much the same thing as saying ax.set xtick labels, right, and then passing it just an empty list. But we can use this kind of entry point of a formatter, right? If you're doing anything dynamic, you can pass in different formatters. And if you just want to turn it off, you could simply pass in a null formatter instead of actually having to manually set the labels. You can also pass in a string, right? That if I wanted my x-axis to be in dollar values, you can pass in a formatted string. And the trick to this is that x is the current label on the x-axis and pause is the position, right? So if we look at my major ticks here, the first one's at position 0, the next one's at position 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. It's just the relative position of the tick itself, not within the data coordinate space. You can also pass a function that accepts both an x and a position, and then you can do anything you want with either the x or the position, and you can return it, and it will actually map your axes to those values. Or map your labels, I should say. But when does this become useful? So here, if I go back to drawing 2 empty axes and I plot my data using pandas convenience.plot.bar method, wow. I hope you are looking at that lower set of axes on those labels and just being like, what the heck is that? I want to show you something. Let's try plotting it using Matplotlib's .bar method and simply just passing in the data index and the data itself. I hope you can already think that the top set of axes looks much better than the ones that pandas generated. This is because, I'll get to that in a moment. Let's try and fix our axes here. We can use our locators and formatters that we just talked about. Let's try doing it on that lower set of axes and see if we're able to actually get something meaningful out of our data. So if I use a month locator, I should be getting the 1st and 7th month automatically labeled or located as my major ticks. And then my formatter, I'm asking for the first 3, or kind of the shorthand name of the date along with its year, the date by the month. And when I apply this to my lower axes, I get January of 1970. It's 2020 in my upper axes. What's happening here is that Pandas is doing just a little bit of work for you. Pandas assumes that whenever you draw a bar plot, you actually have a categorical x-axis. And when it wants to draw a bar plot, to map categories to a continuous space that we draw all of our plots on, Pandas will actually swap out your x values with a range from 0 to the length of your data. It will then overlay the labels from your data as on top of those x ticks that range from 0 to length of your data. And that's why we end up with January of 1970, because that corresponds to an epoch of 0. Now, when I use my locators on my top set of axes, we see that I end up with actually dates that are just a little bit more readable, in my opinion. We can get the shorthand of the name of the month instead of having 01, 07, etc. And I can even use a month locator if I wanted to label, every month, have ticks, I should say, on every month, along with major ticks that will help space out my locators here for me. And so using these locators, these major and minor locators, is definitely, in my opinion, the way to go when you're trying to play around with your ticks and your labels. With that all being said, I think you have the skills to take your X and Y axis, take those ticks, take those labels, and really convey a message from your plot and really make it pretty.